The signal from the front lines wasn't a request for aid. It was a fading whisper of a final stand. It's 0047 hours on the cold night of October 23, 1944. A terrifying silence clings to the Hurtgen forest near the German-Belgian frontier. 42 soldiers of Easy Company 502nd Paratrooper Infantry are cornered. They've been stuck for 16 brutal hours in a crumbling, isolated building 3 kilometers behind enemy positions. The Wehrmacht knows their precise location. Major William Hendricks stood rigid in the command tent, the map's glare reflecting off his face, as Captain Frank Morrison's voice deteriorated from determined conviction to raw, agonizing pleading across 3 desperate radio transmissions. Morrison's unit had parachuted in the previous day at first light, part of a mission for reconnaissance that had gone terribly wrong. The intelligence reports claimed minimal resistance. That information was tragically mistaken. An entire SS Panzer Grenadier battalion had moved into the sector just 12 hours before the jump commenced. 8 of my injured can't move, Morrison's voice sputtered. We have maybe 2 hours of ammunition left. They are bringing up heavy armor. We need immediate exfiltration. The stark reality was impossible to ignore. 2 attempts to retrieve them had already failed spectacularly. Charlie Company lost 11 men trying to force a route through at dusk. A tank platoon from the 3rd Armored Division advanced within 800 meters before German 88mm guns crippled 2 of their Sherman tanks, forcing the remaining vehicles to beat a hasty retreat. The danger zone was a killing field of layered machine gun fire, pre-sighted mortar positions, and no fewer than 4 concealed anti-tank cannons entrenched on the surrounding high ground. Hendricks faced the awful decision that chills every commanding officer. He could deploy another company and potentially sacrifice 30 more men for only a 20% likelihood of success, or he could wait until dawn for air support, by which time Morrison's paratroopers would almost certainly be dead or captured. He chose a third path of inaction. "We hold until daybreak," he informed his staff. "Prepare the fighter bombers for a 0600 takeoff." What Major Hendricks remained unaware of was that just 400 meters away, a 22-year-old private named Danny Sullivan was lying awake in his shelter, overhearing every single word through the thin canvas walls. Sullivan knew that isolated structure. He'd grown up on a homestead exactly like it in the rural heart of Pennsylvania. He knew the local geography because his own squad had recently patrolled that precise area just a fortnight earlier. And Private Danny Sullivan was forming a plan that would either result in his immediate court-martial or immortalize him as a hero. It was very likely to accomplish both. To fully grasp why no one in the chain of command could have possibly believed Danny Sullivan capable of saving those paratroopers, you must first understand exactly who Private Sullivan was, and perhaps more importantly, what he wasn't. Private First Class Daniel James Sullivan joined the military on his 18th birthday in March 1942, 3 months following the attack on Pearl Harbor. He washed out of officer candidate training after 6 weeks. Excessively impulsive, his instructors recorded. Does not adhere to established combat protocols. Displays flawed judgment when under duress. He failed paratrooper instruction on 2 separate occasions. The first time was due to an injury sustained during a poor landing. The second was for defiance when he challenged the wisdom of jumping into a training zone he argued was tactically exposed. He was correct about the tactical flaws, which somehow infuriated his commanding officers even more. By October 1944, Sullivan had served for 8 months with the 3rd Armored Division's Logistical Support Unit, functioning primarily as a clerk and occasionally assisting with mechanical repairs. His service record contained 3 letters of formal disciplinary action, 2 Article 15 punishments for minor infractions, and precisely 0 commendations for bravery or merit. His immediate superior, Earl Mackey, once bluntly told him, "Sullivan, you calculate too much and obey too little. That will get you killed, or worse, get someone else killed." The Army had attempted every conventional strategy to reach Captain Morrison's trapped paratroopers. The afternoon attack at 14:30 hours was executed exactly by the book. Infantry advancing behind a barrage of heavy artillery, supported by tanks, following meticulous reconnaissance. The outcome, 11 dead or wounded, 0 ground gained. The push by the armored vehicles at 1730 hours adhered to every doctrine of the tank warfare manual. The outcome: 2 completely ruined Shermans, 3 crew members killed, the survivors forced to beat a hasty retreat. The danger zone was a killing field of layered machine gun fire, pre-sighted mortar positions, and no fewer than 4 concealed anti-tank cannons entrenched on the surrounding high ground. Hendricks faced the awful decision that chills every commanding officer. He could deploy another company and potentially sacrifice 30 more men for only a 20% likelihood of success, or he could wait until dawn for air support, by which time Morrison's paratroopers would almost certainly be dead or captured. He chose a third path of inaction. "We hold until daybreak," he informed his staff. "Prepare the fighter bombers for a 0600 takeoff." Quote, "Sometimes courage means acting when everyone else says to wait." What none of them had taken into consideration was that Private Danny Sullivan had never been one to read the established textbooks. His 6 months spent working as a mechanic's assistant meant he knew for a fact that 3 Sherman tanks were parked in the motor pool only 200 meters from his tent, completely fueled and ready for the next day's operation. His 2 weeks spent patrolling that specific area meant he knew there was a neglected logging track, barely wide enough for a tank, that approached the farmhouse from the northeast angle. The Germans were likely not observing too closely because everyone assumed the route was simply impassable. And Private Danny Sullivan possessed something critical that the established experts lacked. He had listened intently to Captain Morrison's voice coming through the static on that radio. Morrison was also a native of Pennsylvania. He had mentioned it once during a joint training maneuver. Morrison had a spouse named Sarah and a 4-year-old daughter named Emma. Sullivan had seen the worn photograph. At 0315 hours, while Major Hendricks slept soundly and the motor pool guard was walking the far side of the military compound, checking a boundary report, Danny Sullivan made a profound decision that would either result in the preservation of 40 lives or the end of his own. He was going to commandeer an armored tank. Danny Sullivan pressed himself into the dense shadows 50 meters from the motor pool, observing Corporal Jenkins, the night watchman, perform his routine patrols. Jenkins was completely predictable. Every 20 minutes, he completed the full perimeter circuit, which took him completely out of sight of the parked tanks for approximately 4 minutes. Sullivan patiently waited. His heart hammered furiously against his ribs. This was utterly insane. This was the kind of insanity that resulted in a court-martial. This was potentially the kind of insanity that warranted a firing squad. But Captain Morrison and his men had perhaps 90 minutes left before the Germans launched their inevitable assault on that building, and Sullivan knew with absolute terrifying certainty that the neglected logging trail approach held a genuine possibility of success. He had discovered it 2 weeks earlier when his squad was establishing an observation post. Everyone else had simply walked right past it, dismissing it as too restricted and too overgrown. But Sullivan had grown up driving his father's heavy farm tractor through the timber country of Pennsylvania. He understood what kind of punishment a tank could absorb and push through. He estimated the clearance with his eye. 7 feet wide, perhaps 8. A Sherman tank measures 9 feet 8 inches wide. It would be incredibly tight, but it was physically possible. 0322 hours, Jenkins vanished around the motor pool's eastern edge. Sullivan moved swiftly. He crossed the exposed ground in 15 seconds, crouching low between 2 half-tracks. The 3 Sherman tanks sat in a perfect row, looming dark and utterly silent. He knew precisely which one to choose. The M4A3E8 on the left, the one Sergeant Kowalski's crew had nicknamed Lucky, because it had operated for 4 months without a single mechanical issue. More importantly, Sullivan had personally helped service it just the day before. He knew it was fully fueled, completely armed, and mechanically sound. The entry hatch was not locked. Tankers stationed in a quiet rear area motor pool simply do not lock their hatches, because who in their right mind would be foolish enough to try and steal a 33-ton tank? Sullivan pulled himself up, his heavy boots clonking softly on the metal hull. He dropped down through the turret hatch into the commander's position, then quickly slid forward into the driver's seat. The tank's interior reeked of thick oil, burnt cordite, and the stale perspiration of 100 combat missions. His hands instinctively found the proper controls in the thick darkness. 6 months spent watching tank crews had taught him far more than he had ever realized.
He remembered the precise startup sequence. Battery switch on, fuel pump engaged, wait for the required pressure. The massive radial engine required a specific ignition protocol. Engage the primer, count slowly to 3, hit the starter button. The starter motor whined loudly. The engine sputtered once. It died. Sullivan's hands were shaking uncontrollably. Jenkins would be back in 90 seconds flat. He tried the entire process again. Primer, count, starter. The 9-cylinder Wright R975 radial engine suddenly roared to life with a sound like rolling thunder. 9 cylinders, 400 horsepower, a massive sound that would instantly awaken every single man in the compound. Sullivan did not hesitate for a second. There was absolutely no opportunity to turn back now. He released the heavy brake, engaged the transmission, and the 33-ton Sherman lurched forward with a terrible mechanical moan. Behind him, men were already shouting angrily. In front of him, the motor pool's main gate was closed, but not secured. He aimed the tank directly at the wooden structure. The Sherman hit the barrier at approximately 8 miles per hour. Wood and metal shattered outward in an explosion. A continuous alarm bell began ringing somewhere in the distance. Sullivan shifted into second gear and accelerated hard toward the distant line of trees. He had perhaps 3 minutes before anyone could organize an armed pursuit. He had approximately 90 minutes to successfully save 40 men. And he had 0 authority, 0 backup support, and absolutely no strategy beyond driving fast and somehow staying alive. The logging path was rougher than Sullivan recalled. The Sherman crashed violently through the thick underbrush at 15 miles per hour. Tree limbs screamed against the steel hull like sharp fingernails dragging across metal. Sullivan navigated by the weak moonlight filtering down through the dense forest canopy. One hand remained firmly on the left steering lever, the other on the right, constantly making adjustments to prevent the 33-ton monster from sliding off the narrow track into the shallow ravine. He was completely alone, terrifyingly, utterly alone. A Sherman tank officially required a crew of 5: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Sullivan was one man attempting to execute all 5 roles simultaneously. He could not operate the main gun. That required a man in the turret. He could not properly use the radio while attempting to drive. He could not even accurately aim the bow machine gun if he tried. The official tank doctrine established at Fort Knox in 1940 was explicit. A tank is a weapon system designed to be operated by a crew. One person operating a Sherman was like one person attempting to pilot a heavy bomber. Technically possible, yet suicidally reckless. But Sullivan was not thinking about official doctrine. He was focused on the map he had memorized, the rough terrain he had traversed 2 weeks ago, and the critical fact that Morrison's paratroopers now had only approximately 70 minutes of ammunition remaining. 03:48 hours. The trail opened up slightly. Through the driver's periscope, Sullivan caught his first clear sight of the valley and immediately understood why the 2 previous rescue attempts had failed. The farmhouse was located in a natural basin surrounded by higher elevations on 3 sides. German positions were scattered along the ridgelines like sharp, deadly teeth. Sullivan counted at least 6 concentrated muzzle flashes from heavy machine guns, all focused relentlessly on the southern approach, where the primary road entered the valley. Mortar rounds were exploding across the farmhouse's position in a steady, systematic pattern. Tracer rounds arced through the blackness like lethal, incandescent fireworks. Morrison's troops were still actively fighting. They were still alive. Sullivan's approach from the northeast positioned him 800 meters from his target, with the minimum amount of German emplantments between him and his objective. But there was a serious problem. The logging path terminated in 200 meters at a shallow creek bed. Beyond that point, the ground was wide open. The Sherman would be completely exposed. The Germans would easily hear the engines roar. Every anti-tank weapon in the valley would immediately pivot toward the noise. Sullivan pulled the tank to a halt, the engine idling roughly, and took a moment to think. For the first time since he had stolen the tank, he considered the consequences if he had miscalculated. If the Germans possessed significantly more firepower than he had estimated, if the Sherman lost a track crossing the creek bed, if he managed to reach the farmhouse but could not successfully extricate the paratroopers. Behind him, he knew American soldiers were organizing a pursuit. Major Hendricks had probably already issued orders for his arrest. Military police were likely mobilizing. If he retreated now, he would face a court-martial, but he would survive. If he pressed forward, he would either save 40 men or die in the attempt. He thought about his own father, who had been killed in a factory accident when Danny was 16. You do it. You don't ask permission. You don't wait for someone else. His father's last instruction to him: when you notice something that requires action and nobody else will take it, you act. You don't seek approval. You don't wait for another person. You simply do it. Sullivan pulled himself up, his heavy boots clonking softly on the metal hull. He dropped down through the turret hatch into the commander's position, then quickly slid forward into the driver's seat. The tank's interior reeked of thick oil, burnt cordite, and the stale perspiration of 100 combat missions. His hands instinctively found the proper controls in the thick darkness. 6 months spent watching tank crews had taught him far more than he had ever realized. He remembered the precise startup sequence: battery switch on, fuel pump engaged, wait for the required pressure. The massive radial engine required a specific ignition protocol: engage the primer, count slowly to 3, hit the starter button. The starter motor whined loudly. The engine sputtered once. It died. Sullivan's hands were shaking uncontrollably. Jenkins would be back in 90 seconds flat. He tried the entire process again: primer, count, starter. The 9-cylinder Wright R975 radial engine suddenly roared to life with a sound like rolling thunder. 9 cylinders, 400 horsepower, a massive sound that would instantly awaken every single man in the compound. Sullivan did not hesitate for a second. There was absolutely no opportunity to turn back now. He released the heavy brake, engaged the transmission, and the 33-ton Sherman lurched forward with a terrible mechanical moan. Behind him, men were already shouting angrily. In front of him, the motor pool's main gate was closed but not secured. He aimed the tank directly at the wooden structure. The Sherman hit the barrier at approximately 8 miles per hour. Wood and metal shattered outward in an explosion. A continuous alarm bell began ringing somewhere in the distance. Sullivan shifted into second gear and accelerated hard toward the distant line of trees. He had perhaps 3 minutes before anyone could organize an armed pursuit. He had approximately 90 minutes to successfully save 40 men. And he had 0 authority, 0 backup support, and absolutely no strategy beyond driving fast and somehow staying alive. The logging path was rougher than Sullivan recalled. The Sherman crashed violently through the thick underbrush at 15 miles per hour. Tree limbs screamed against the steel hull like sharp fingernails dragging across metal. Sullivan navigated by the weak moonlight filtering down through the dense forest canopy. One hand remained firmly on the left steering lever, the other on the right, constantly making adjustments to prevent the 33-ton monster from sliding off the narrow track into the shallow ravine. He was completely alone. Terrifyingly, utterly alone. A Sherman tank officially required a crew of 5: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Sullivan was one man attempting to execute all 5 roles simultaneously. He could not operate the main gun. That required a man in the turret. He could not properly use the radio while attempting to drive. He could not even accurately aim the bow machine gun if he tried. The official tank doctrine established at Fort Knox in 1940 was explicit. A tank is a weapon system designed to be operated by a crew. One person operating a Sherman was like one person attempting to pilot a heavy bomber. Technically possible, yet suicidally reckless. But Sullivan was not thinking about official doctrine. He was focused on the map he had memorized, the rough terrain he had traversed.
I took a measurement. A Sherman is 9 feet 8 inches, but if you retract the track guards and don't worry about scratching the paint. This is lunacy, Thornton muttered, turning back to Hendricks. Sir, we must order artillery to cut off his approach. If the Germans seize that Sherman intact, they will use it against our lines. We cannot let... We will let it happen, Hendricks stated quietly. Every man in the tent froze instantly. Sir, Thornton's voice was dangerously low, that private has just stolen a 33-ton tank. He is jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar asset. He is operating completely without authorization inside a combat zone. He could inadvertently trigger a German counterattack.
And he is also about to achieve something that every one of us declared was impossible. Hendricks cut him off. He was intensely focused on the map, running complex mental calculations. How close is he to the target? A young lieutenant rapidly checked the coordinates. If he is where he claims to be, 600 meters, sir. The radio crackled once more. Blackjack 6, I require you to do something essential for me. Inform Captain Morrison I am approaching from the northeast. Have his troops prepared to move in 2 minutes. I cannot stop. If I stop moving, I become a stationary target. They must be ready to board the second I arrive. Board the vehicle? Captain Morrison's own voice suddenly cut in on the same channel. Son, you cannot fit 40 men inside a Sherman tank. No, sir, Sullivan replied, but I can accommodate them on the exterior, the hull, the turret, the engine deck. I have seen displaced civilians riding tanks across France. We can potentially pack 15 soldiers on the outside if they hold on tightly. I will make 2 separate trips. 2 trips, Thornton was aghast. The Germans will be expecting— It is the only viable option, sir, Sullivan interrupted, unless you can offer a better suggestion within the next 90 seconds. The room fell into a heavy silence. Every man inside that command tent knew that Private Sullivan was absolutely correct. Every standard approach had failed. Every textbook solution had already been attempted. What Sullivan was undertaking was tactically indefensible, mechanically unfeasible, and entirely insubordinate. It was also the only shred of hope Morrison's men had left. Hendricks looked over at Thornton. Thornton stared intensely at the map. The clock read 03:55 hours. "May God help me," Hendricks whispered. Then he spoke into the microphone. "Morrison, prepare your men. Sullivan, you have one single chance at this. Make it a success." "Yes, sir." "And Sullivan, sir, I am extremely sorry about the motor pool gate. I will cover the cost of the damages if I make it back. If this tale of one soldier's utterly impossible choice has gripped your attention, please take a moment to hit that like button. We're moving now to the most intense part of this operation. This is the precise moment where everything Danny Sullivan believed about personal courage and ultimate duty was tested directly under fire. The Sherman tank burst dramatically from the tree line at 03:56 hours, and every German position within 800 meters opened fire simultaneously. Sullivan saw the bright muzzle flashes moments before he heard the impacts. A dozen MG-42 machine guns were stitching continuous tracers across the blackness. Mortar rounds were already in the air, and somewhere on the high ridgeline, an 88mm anti-tank cannon was precisely tracking his movement. The machine gun rounds felt like nothing more than minor mosquito bites against the Sherman's thick armor plating. Ping, 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 the distinct sound of 7.92mm rounds ricocheting harmlessly off 3 inches of dense steel. Sullivan kept the accelerator pedal pressed completely to the floor. The radial engine shrieked at its maximum RPM. 33 tons of American steel hurtled across 600 meters of exposed ground at 26 miles per hour. The first 88M shell narrowly missed by 10 feet, detonating in a massive geyser of dirt and debris to his left. The powerful concussion violently shook the entire tank. Sullivan made an immediate correction, maneuvering the tank in a zigzag pattern, as much as the Sherman's sheer bulk would allow. Tank drivers were strictly instructed never to drive in a straight line while under enemy fire. Make your movements unpredictable. Force the enemy gunner to guess your path. 400 meters remaining to the farmhouse. A mortar round exploded 20 feet directly in his path. Sullivan did not slow down. The Sherman crashed violently through the fresh crater, the suspension screaming in protest, the track links groaning under the immense stress. For one terrifying second, the nose dipped sharply, and Sullivan thought the tank would flip over, but the weight of the engine pulled the beast through and up the opposite side. The second 88M shell struck. The resulting explosion was deafening. The shell impacted the Sherman's right front glacis slope armor at 2,800 feet per second and deflected. The German gunner's angle had been too shallow. Instead of penetrating the hull, the round ricocheted upward, ripping off the right side fender and one of the track guards in a bright shower of incandescent sparks. Sullivan barely registered the damage. The Sherman was still moving forward, the engine was still running smoothly, and the tracks were still turning. 200 meters. He could clearly see the farmhouse now through his driver's periscope, a dark, jagged silhouette punctuated by the bright muzzle flashes from Morrison's men returning fire. He could see shapes moving quickly. Men were getting ready. The Germans finally understood what was happening. The machine gun fire intensified dramatically, shifting its focus from the farmhouse to the rapidly approaching tank. Hundreds of rounds per minute hammered the hull, the turret, and the engine deck. None penetrated the armor, but the noise inside the tank was absolutely deafening, a metallic hailstorm that made rational thought nearly impossible. 100 meters. Sullivan spotted the German infantry squad situated between him and the objective. 8 soldiers in a shallow, hastily dug trench. One of them was lifting a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket launcher, aiming directly at the tank. The Panzerfaust's shaped carge warhead could easily punch through 4 inches of armor at this short range. At this distance, it was absolutely lethal. Sullivan executed the only viable maneuver he could think of. He aimed the Sherman directly at the trench position and pressed the accelerator even harder. The German soldier with the Panzerfaust fired his weapon. The rocket-propelled grenade launched with a flash and a high-pitched whoosh and passed 3 feet directly over the Sherman's turret, missing because the tank was closer and moving significantly faster than the soldier had anticipated. The Sherman did not miss its target. 33 tons traveling at 26 miles per hour slammed into the German trench like a massive, unstoppable meteor. Soldiers scattered frantically. The tank crashed through and completely over the position, track links grinding heavily across the soil and sandbags. 50 meters. Sullivan manually triggered the hull-mounted .30 caliber machine gun, firing completely blind, spraying bullets wildly across the German positions to his right. He had no way of knowing if he was hitting anything, but the psychological impact was instant and decisive. Tracer fire forced the Germans to dive for cover, disrupting their aim for a few precious seconds. 20 meters. Sullivan slammed the brakes violently. The Sherman skidded to a complete halt in a spray of gravel and dust. The tank's massive hull was now positioned between the farmhouse and the primary German firing positions. 33 tons of mobile, impenetrable cover. "Go! Go! Go!" Morrison's voice erupted over the radio, dispensing with all protocol and call signs. Sullivan threw open his hatch and climbed out into the chaos. The noise was overwhelming. Continuous machine gun fire, nearby mortar explosions, men screaming, the Sherman's huge engine still roaring loudly at idle. Paratroopers streamed out of the shattered farmhouse. Not 42 men, Sullivan quickly realized, but closer to 35. The remainder were casualties, either dead or too grievously injured to move on their own. "On the tank! Move!" Morrison was everywhere at once, grabbing men, violently shoving them towards the Sherman. They clambered frantically up the hull, finding handholds on the turret, the engine deck, the track guards. Hands gripped the cold steel, bodies pressed tightly together. A mortar round landed 15 feet away. Shrapnel violently pinged off the tank's armor.
One paratrooper screamed and instantly fell. Morrison hauled him up, blood gushing from the man's leg, and physically threw him onto the engine deck, where 2 other soldiers secured him. Sullivan quickly counted heads. 15, 16, 17 men clinging precariously to the Sherman like barnacles on a ship's hull. "That's all who can possibly fit," Morrison yelled, hauling himself up near the turret. "Go!" "What about the others?" Sullivan yelled back through the deafening noise. "I'm staying here. Get these men out alive and come back immediately for the rest of us." There was no time whatsoever for further argument. Sullivan dropped back down into the driver's seat and slammed the transmission into reverse gear. The Sherman lurched backward heavily, and Sullivan heard men shouting, gripping tighter. He could not see behind him. The driver's periscope only faced forward, so he navigated completely by memory, praying fervently he didn't strike a deep crater or a ditch that would throw the men off the vehicle. The Germans had successfully figured out his strategy. The 88mm gunner was actively tracking their movement now. Sullivan saw the muzzle flash a split second before the shell arrived. The round passed 6 inches directly over the turret. Sullivan felt the intense pressure wave, heard one of the paratroopers scream, but nobody fell off the tank. He shifted into forward gear and accelerated back the way he had come. 17 men clinging desperately to a speeding tank while focused German fire chased them across 800 meters of open, dangerous ground. The return journey took 90 seconds that felt like a lifetime. Sullivan continually zigzagged. Mortar rounds exploded left and right. Machine gun tracers arced through the darkness. The Sherman absorbed hit after hit, armor plating sparking brightly, paint scorching away, but the engine kept powerfully running and the tracks kept turning. At 0403 hours, the Sherman crashed back into the American lines. Medics instantly swarmed the tank, pulling the wounded paratroopers down, rushing them directly to aid stations. The 17 men Sullivan had just rescued stumbled away from the tank on shaking, exhausted legs. One of them, a sergeant with a blood-soaked bandage wrapped around his head, turned back and snapped a salute toward the Sherman. Sullivan didn't see it. He was already spinning the tank around. "What in God's name are you doing?" Hendricks was suddenly standing right beside the tank, having run from the command tent. Sullivan looked down at him from the commander's hatch. "Sir, there are still 18 men trapped back there. Captain Morrison stayed behind." "Sullivan, you have already accomplished—" "I am going back, sir, with or without your authorization." Hendricks stared hard at him for 3 seconds, his jaw tight. "Load them up with extra ammunition. Get a proper crew for him." "No time, sir. They are down to maybe 20 minutes of ammo." Sullivan dropped back into the tank before Hendricks could issue another order. The Sherman lurched forward, heading back toward the dark logging trail, back toward the valley, back toward the 18 men still trapped in that farmhouse. Behind him, Hendricks turned to his staff officers, his voice low and firm. "Prepare our artillery to provide maximum covering fire immediately, and get me those fighter bombers airborne early. I do not care if you have to personally wake up Eisenhower himself." Before we reveal the climax of this impossible rescue, please take a quick moment to like this video. It significantly helps WW2 Deep Insights share these important stories of immense courage, like Danny Sullivan's, with a wider audience. Thank you. Now, here is what transpired on that decisive second run. The second trip was noticeably worse. Sullivan emerged from the tree line at 0414 hours to discover that the Germans had entirely repositioned their forces. They knew his exact approach now. They knew precisely what he was trying to achieve. The 88mm gun had been relocated to a far superior firing position. 2 additional machine gun nests had been quickly established along his expected route. But something else had also changed profoundly. American artillery had opened fire. Hendricks had committed every single gun within range to systematically suppressing the German positions. The ridge lines erupted in continuous, massive explosions, and overhead, early, impossibly early, Sullivan heard the unmistakable roar of P-47 Thunderbolts diving from 8,000 feet, their 50-caliber machine guns tearing apart German emplacements. The Sherman completed the 800-meter sprint in exactly 3 minutes. Morrison and 17 more paratroopers scrambled onto the hull, the turret, and the engine deck. One soldier was barely conscious, held firmly in place by his comrades. Sullivan could faintly hear them praying as he accelerated back toward the American lines. The 88mm fired one final desperate shot. It struck the Sherman's left track, and Sullivan felt the sickening, violent lurch as the track snapped cleanly. The tank swerved sharply to the left, grinding to a complete halt 200 meters from friendly lines. "Everyone off! Run!" Sullivan screamed above the engine. "Run!" The paratroopers immediately jumped off, stumbled, and sprinted through the pre-dawn darkness while German fire chased their forms. Sullivan climbed out last, abandoned the crippled Sherman, and sprinted behind them. They all made it out alive, every single one of them. 35 paratroopers were successfully evacuated, 0 were killed during the extraction process, and the 8 wounded soldiers all survived their injuries, and 1 completely unauthorized private had just committed what would later be formally characterized as the most spectacular act of both insubordination and heroism in the entire division's history. The ensuing court-martial hearing lasted exactly 15 minutes. The Medal of Honor ceremony lasted much longer. Private First Class Danny Sullivan, immediately promoted 3 ranks to Staff Sergeant on the spot, was awarded America's highest military decoration on November 8, 1944. Major Hendricks personally submitted the recommendation. Captain Morrison testified on his behalf. All 17 paratroopers from the first trip submitted written statements. Sullivan's simple response when the medal was pinned to his chest, "I simply did what was required, sir." Following the conclusion of the war, Sullivan returned to his home in Pennsylvania and never spoke publicly about the incredible events of that night. He worked quietly as a mechanic for 40 years, raised 3 children, and passed away peacefully in 1989 at the age of 67. His Medal of Honor is displayed at the Smithsonian Museum. The dented helmet he wore during the rescue operation sits today in his grandson's living room in Pittsburgh. The damaged tank, the one Sullivan abandoned 200 meters from the American position, was recovered 2 days later and sent to a repair depot. It was fully rebuilt, returned to active service, and fought in 7 additional major engagements before the war concluded. Tankers who later served in the vehicle frequently reported that it never again suffered a mechanical breakdown. They proudly referred to it as the Lucky Tank. Captain Frank Morrison survived the war, returned home to Pennsylvania, and named his second daughter, born in 1946, Danielle. Military historians continue to debate whether Sullivan's action constituted brilliant battlefield improvisation or reckless, unauthorized endangerment. Tank doctrine manuals now contain a specific footnote regarding single-operator emergency procedures, directly inspired by the events of that night. The logging trail Sullivan utilized has been permanently preserved and is part of a military historical park in Belgium. But perhaps the most enduring legacy came in 1987 when a determined reporter finally convinced Sullivan to grant an interview about the rescue. The reporter inquired if he would undertake the same action again, fully aware that it was unauthorized, knowing that it could have cost him his life. Sullivan paused, thinking for a long moment. Then he produced a worn, creased photograph. 43 men were standing together, all of them gray-haired now, all of them smiling broadly at a reunion in 1985. These men were able to go home, Sullivan said quietly. They got the chance to raise families, pursue careers, have lives, all because someone decided to disregard the rulebook one night in 1944. He paused again. So yes, I would do it again, without hesitation, every single time. The fundamental lesson is not about the reckless act of breaking rules. It is about deeply understanding that sometimes heroism means taking action when everyone else is advising delay, moving forward when all the experts declare it's impossible, and ultimately caring far more about doing what is right than about remaining personally safe. Danny Sullivan did not seek permission. He did not wait for formal approval. He saw fellow soldiers who needed help, and he helped them. Sometimes that simple act is precisely what heroism looks like. One ordinary person concluding that impossible simply means no one has yet possessed enough determination to try.